Well, hello. Welcome to Happy Classrooms, my new YouTube video channel. My name's Duncan, or as the children would like to call me, Sir, or Mr. McCabe. I retired from teaching high school English last year, and before I forget, I'd like to commit some of what I learned in my 33 years as a teacher to video. I was very fortunate in the last 17 years to have lots and lots of happy classroom experiences, hence the title of this YouTube channel. Now, before that, teaching was a struggle. I was quite slow to learn. I was fortunate enough to be autistic, and that's led to a few things. I had an autistic childhood. Environmentally, I was very separate from communities and social things and learned very slowly, but the three brothers, my two brothers and I, were all autistic in their own way, and I realised about my autism only latterly, only in the last 10 years maybe. But it's allowed me to learn. It presents problems and you learn slowly, but autistic people learn structurally. So you build rules and structures to understand the world. And in doing so, you tend to learn quite deeply. And certainly you grow a whole load of theories about how things work. And those theories can quite easily be communicated. I ended up mentoring young teachers for quite a few years, and I found I had a lot to say and a lot of guidance to give, and I continue to do that off and on with people. The first few years of teaching were very difficult for me, and so I know what it's like to struggle. My first few years of teaching, it was very slow progress. I really struggled with classroom control at first. That took about 2 years to really feel comfortable. I then moved into my first permanent position after my probation. Things were comfortable and steady. I moved school to a very large school and was promoted up, and classrooms ran easily. However, I felt as if all I was doing was crowd control. I would put out small fires of indiscipline, I would teach the subject, I would present the curriculum, but there were a few warning signals in the back of my mind, especially my attitude to the less able. And I remember feeling irritated towards a boy who clearly couldn't access the curriculum, couldn't access the material that I was presenting, and I was irritated with him, and it really set off an alarm bell. I had a lovely set of experience with two teachers. I had these two sets of memories from teachers who in my high school really inspired me, and they inspired a lot of people. But they didn't inspire people simply to work, which was true, but they also inspired loyalty and affection, and I knew I was nowhere near that. I then set off on a journey where I ended up with, very fortunate enough to end up with, a lot of loyalty, a lot of people very fond of me, which was an amazing thing. So that's really what the focus of this video is here, and the main things that got me there, and across the series of videos, really that's what I'm trying to distill, as well as just general hints and tips and tricks, especially for young teachers or anyone struggling with any particular part of teaching. not that I mastered it in any way. The big single lesson that I learned, and it's a story, I need to tell the story, that's what I tend to do anyway, but it's a personal story, so I need to tell it in order for you to understand the lesson that I went through. So I was in my second big permanent post. It was 6 years long. It was a big high profile school in Glasgow, which is where I come from, hence the Viking accent. And I was very lucky to meet a man there who became a very good friend, who was working in support for learning, learning support, a teacher, qualified teacher in the classroom, or extracting pupils from the classroom, working in a department. And he'd come from that into English. We got on like a house on fire, and he was full of the joys of support for learning. And it occurred to me that I could kind of sidestep out of English. I knew there was a college course attached to it. I was really keen to kind of take a step back and think. So I applied to my school, who were very supportive and sponsored me, if you like, to go out for 2 6-week placements in college, and also, and there was no physical placement, so I did the two 6 weeks placements in college, and it was mind-bendingly awesome to have a refresh like that. I really think that a lot of education suffers from having they talked about that, a front-heavy, front-loaded education, where all your theory comes before you start teaching, and then there's so little opportunity for refreshment. Now, in-service days should be, but they are so infrequently refreshing, mostly infuriating in my experience. So I had this college experience where really they asked questions that I really hadn't considered before, but I really knew as soon as they were asked, I was like, why haven't we considered this? So, like, why do we assess? At what stages do we assess? What do we do with the results of that assessment? And because it was a special educational needs programme, what is the effect of assessing someone who is not academic? And it threw up all kinds of questions that I really didn't have an easy answer for. I then applied out to get a job in a support for learning department. I did a dissertation which was hugely practical. I'll come back to that later. I went out to work in a really deprived school in Glasgow in a support for learning department, and I learned one thing, really, one huge lesson that then allowed me to be much more happy in the classroom. I was there for 3 years. I did an awful lot of work outside of the classroom, running curricular groups, also ethos groups, self-esteem, that kind of thing, behavioural groups. But I was also in quite a few classrooms, and I was in with 2 very, very strong teachers, principal teacher English, principal teacher maths. Now, some people think the principal teachers have extra power in the school, but frequently that's not the case. The post does not hold any weight. It is how those people act in post. They are marginally closer to contacting parents, so that does help in a way. But what I saw with these 2 teachers was remarkable. I saw pupils all over the school, in that school, especially the large handful of behaviourally disturbed pupils coming into their departments to be extracted often into one class that was often mixed abilities and mixed years even, and in those classrooms organised by the principal teacher, those pupils worked really well and were very well motivated and were fond of the teachers. Now, both teachers were, how can you say that? They were not charismatic. They weren't interesting people they weren't colourful, huge characters. Now, in my mind, the two teachers that I was fond of in school had been huge personalities, especially one of them, who was also an opera singer, and we Glasgow boys, 14 of us, bought tickets to Gilbert and Sullivan and went across Scotland in the evenings and watched him and just devoted to him. But these two teachers in this school were not large characters at all. They never talked about anything outside of the classroom. And I asked, the PT Maths was a bit more approachable, and I asked him what his methodology was for this. I was quite taken by the effect on the pupils that he had, and he said, "Well, I have one trick, if you want to call it that, and that is to focus on them and their progress, and make everything, every ounce of my energy focused on that, so that at every point they are aware of my attention to what they're doing. I try to know where every one of them is at." And now that's very difficult because of a good number of people in the class, and they're all at different levels. But that's my big focus, and encouraging them and telling them I know what they're doing and being with them, as it were, in their progress, but giving that respect and really focusing hard on their journey in my classroom. He said, "I never talk about anything else. I don't allow them to talk. They don't come in and talk about the football at the weekend or anything. They try and draw me into conversation. I don't do it. Don't do any of that. It's all about every second counts." And I was quite taken with that, because it was very different to how I had seen teaching. And I think teaching is so complex, because we all bring pictures from the past. We all bring ideals. I entered teaching on the back of Captain My Captain, the Dead Poets Society, and he was a huge character, warm, interesting, and spirit led, if you like. But this man was saying the opposite, and I could really see what the power of it. And I've seen it since. I've seen teachers who are very dry, but especially there was a maths teacher in the last school I was in, and he was renowned. He got people through the higher. He would fill his class 30 at a time, and he got people through the maths higher that could not do it. It was often 60-year repeats. He was especially effective with people who had not managed to get the higher the previous year. The reset rate, the success rate in maths resitting higher was really low, and he would get everyone passed. And his single method was to know exactly where everyone was and focus on that. And pupils said, it's a remarkable experience walking into his classroom, because he knows everything about you and he's focused on you, and even though there's 30 in there. So his was a really unusual talent and skill, and I'm not saying we need to develop that, but hearing that, I was 13 years into my teaching, hearing that from that one teacher really made a lot of sense. And I knew that I had not done that. I'd often used periods off as a reward, where I realised, well, that's the wrong signal, because the reward is progress. The reward shouldn't be time off. Not that time off doesn't have its place, and relaxation, but to have it as the thing that you're looking forward to, we've missed the opportunity. I remember with the English teacher seeing the same thing. She's very similar, very, very similar approach. I remember one event really sticks out in my mind, and it showed me the same thing again in a different way. And I was in her class, and it was seniors, and a girl stopped her work and started to have quiet wee whisper to her friend beside her, and the teacher got her up out the desk, and took her outside, and I went out to learn and to observe. Now this girl I had seen round the school causing mayhem, and this talking to her pal was the least of her crimes that week. The teacher was like, Kimberly, if that was her name, Kimberly, I'm so disappointed. That's how she started. So disappointed. And you see the girls, and you know, you've got so much opportunity here. You've got your work. And she reminded Kimberly of where she was and what she was doing, and she said she's made so much progress last week, and here you are throwing your opportunity away. And you see the girls like, well, miss, I just stopped to have a wee chat. She says, well, no, that's not just what you're doing, it's huge. You're putting yourself off. If you want a rest, what should you do? And Kimberly was, well, maybe I should just look out the window. She said, absolutely, look out the window. Why is talking a bad idea? I'll tell you, because you put yourself off, you engage in something else. You're supposed to be engaged in your work, in your progress, and all the wonderful things you've got in front of you. You not only stop your work and distract yourself, you distract the person beside you, your friend. You're stopping her work, and that conversation could go on for ages, much too long, and you could be really engaged in something else, and then how are you going to get back on track? And also it sends the signal out into the other people in the class. And you could see this, you know, ticking over with Kimberly. Now that was much more emotional than the maths PT would have been, but a very, very similar focus. And I learned in those two conversations, if you like, one observed, I learned an awful lot. The support for learning department closed through some big political move, and I went back to English. I was quite anxious, or I wasn't comfortable, because I hadn't been enjoying English. But I came back in and I went to a wonderful school, multicultural, real big mix between deprivation and privilege, really amazingly broad school that really suited me, with a very strong principal teacher. And as soon as I hit the classroom, it was so comfortable, and ended up very quickly with lots of happy events. Now, that wasn't those events, that big one lesson certainly wasn't all the building blocks. There's quite a few else I'd like to talk about in the next videos, but hopefully that makes sense to you. That one story it's had a big impact on me. I'm going to leave it there, and I hope to see you in the next video.